Right, we're here. Thanks everybody for tuning in. I'm gonna hand it over to Felicia. Make sure to do the basic things and like, share, subscribe while you're here. But because this is a kind of collaborative project and Dr. Denaud is really running the show on this, I'm gonna hand it over to her now, and I'm gonna help with facilitating and doing the slides and the videos and stuff like that. So take it away.
All right, Jay, thank you so much. Good evening, everybody. I'm so excited that this is finally here after some good delays, reformatting things and collaborating with Jay, which I'm so grateful for. I have a lot of things packed in for this evening. We have media to watch. I have a lot of things I'm reading from drafts that I'm working on, so be easy. And then some close reading of texts, which can get boring in person. So it can definitely be boring digitally, but that's the spirit of the workshop or a workshop. And so we're running with it. I hope the motion of the 2 hours, though, keeps you engaged and you come in and out as you need to. So welcome to Workshop 1 of Western Fundamentalism of the Autonomous Frame of Reference Project. My name is Felicia Denaud. I'm a writer and a professor, but I think more importantly, someone fundamentally committed to expressing revolutionary theory in creative ways. I think the market might call this like creative nonfiction, but maybe on Winter and Césaire's note, I call it the science of the word. But it is about that creative storytelling around revolutionary theory. I thank you all for being here because there's no greater gift than your time. I apologize for looking down at my phone. I'm blind, so I would be in your camera if I didn't have a secondary device. And I wanted to be precise about what I say. So a lot is written, but a lot will also go off the slides and bouncing things around and mumbling and rambling as I often do, but hopefully to good effect. So this project, I would say, is principally concerned or motivated by my own desire to speak back to the world and to initiate something like revolutionary consequences in a good way. Politics are about consequence. And power is about consequence, and taking control of social reality in a material way. And that, Terry, is what fascinates me. Today, though, I'm more interested in a creative practice than like a staging of my arguments or rehearsal of my arguments. And I actually think I don't do the rehearsal of arguments too much. So much of what I'm trying to say exists in the language and in the form and in the plot. So I want to show you how I think about generating my own autonomous frame. And I think that corresponds to an effort to generate categories, concepts that put pressure on reality and allow people to show up. And I keep saying reality because that's an underlying motif. I think of Winter's autonomous frame article, Césaire on the colonial constitution of reality, all these things. Obviously with our material base and that beautiful and messy and unresolved interaction between them. I hate that I have to take up so much vocal space tonight, so I've invited Jay to interject whenever he feels like it. And he also has just such powerful, he has a powerful ability to contextualize and to make connections. Even in discussing the film I asked you to watch, which I did with a double-edged sword, hoping that you came to critical conclusions, but we'll talk about it. So Jay has some great things to say, and so he can come in and we'll come in when and as he wishes. And then maybe if he feels like wrapping us up at the end, that would be great. Jay, can you go to the Warman slide? Let's see, I'm already at 6:09. So I'll be prompting Jay with the slide, so forgive us for that back and forth, and I get a little manic with that. Okay, so to give you an overview of the evening, because we might not get where I want to go. It's definitely possible we don't get there, but because I potentially have you across 3 sessions, I'm not putting as much pressure on myself to get through everything. there is a design in this where the concepts will rise and fall and assert themselves. And there's a demonstrative effort here. I'm trying to demonstrate. And so I do things then to break them down, particularly around gender, as you'll see across the three workshops, and some new thinking there. So that's to say, this is really open, and ride with me on it. So for the warm-in, I have a couple of exercises, a couple of things I'm going to ask you to do. Introduce yourself in the chat, being mindful we're on the internet. So be smart. You know, Malcolm, not that I'm Malcolm, but he always addressed his enemies in every public talk. So introduce yourself and see if you can move away from this series forming some kind of collaborative partnership or something. Drop a line from Discourse on Colonialism, one that arrested you, the thesis. Distill that essay into its most potent line, and you can put it in the chat. I unfortunately will not be looking at these things, but I hope to look at them after, and that you guys are generating your own stuff. The way I typically run my classroom is like it has a lot of moving parts. Some people are doing this, some people are doing that, some people are doing and then it comes together with this kind of rotational force. And so I hope we can replicate that a little bit, even though I can't see where you're going, but I'm giving you things to do. Okay, so then I'll read you a poem by June Jordan, because all good things begin with June Jordan. And then I'm going to share like 4 concepts that I'm working on. They are really exciting to me personally, and they all are kind of connective tissue for this idea of Western fundamentalism, which might remain undefined as we go through. But these are maybe pillars that I'm working with. And so I ask you to maybe get into your surrealist mode and just do some automatic writing after I read some of these prompts. Who comes to mind? What comes to mind? What settings? What historical, events? What other people? What art? What? Then a homework assignment for next workshop. And I want to put it on your radar now, because you might want to do it as I'm speaking. But I'm going to ask you to go to Forensic Architecture's website, check them out, and choose one of their reports. And as you research who they are, you'll understand why it fits into the nature of this workshop series. But they have pioneered some interesting digital methods around surveillance of human rights. We'll talk about humanitarian warfare, conflicts around the world, but I'm more interested in the methods, the way they come at genocidal conflict, and just the body of knowledge being built there. And so please do that. And then I had wanted to screen clips of different uprisings, global uprisings. I wanted to show some stuff out of Palestine. I wanted to show some stuff out of Haiti and the Wakale movement, but it kind of fell out of the rhythm of this. So I ask you to share with each other, share with me to the email address, things we should know about. Because a lot of the conceptualization is around the power encountered, but there has to be that sense that we're also building the archive of what we're doing about it. This is a moment of incredible courage, incredible courage. And so keeping those real reference in the air, because I get pretty up there, I get pretty theoretical, but there's always an embodied referent. There's always a historical referent. There's always something there. Okay, so those are your tasks. I'm going to go ahead and then read these prompts. And then I'm going to read a little bit from my manuscript. And in doing that, it will stage kind of the media session. But reading from my book, I hope to give you the style and the stakes of what I'm trying to introduce today. And then we'll kind of hop around some theoretical movements I'm trying to make with Césaire and Marx and Fanon and Winter. And we'll end with this idea of the immaculate conception of the West and creation stories. And if we get there, the creation story will be about the Civil War and Dangerfield Newby. So if you don't know him, very exciting. For the poem, a ceremonial opening, if you will. But there are also some strokes in this poem that I want to amplify across the thinkers we'll encounter today. This is called Poem for Haruko. I never thought I'd keep a record of my pain or happiness, like candles lighting the entire soft lace of the air, around the full length of your hair, a shower, organized by God, in brown and auburn undulations, luminous like particles of flame. But now I do. Retrieve an afternoon of apricots and water interspersed with cigarettes and sand and rocks we walked across. How easily you held my hand beside the low tide of the world. How easily you held my hand beside the low tide of the world. Now I do relive an evening of retreat, a bridge I left behind where all the solid heat of lust and tender trembling lay as cruel and as kind as passion spins in infinite tergiverations. Now that's a word. In between the bitter and the sweet, alone and longing for you. Now I do. I love how easily you held my hand beside the low tide of the world. I love to open with a love poem because defense is an act of love, to riff on Joy James. Every defense is an act of love. Césaire declares in Discourse on Colonialism, I make a systematic defense of the civilizations erased. This concept, this method of a systematic defense brings me to Rodney Hinton, brings me to LA, brings me to a lot of different places. It's about the threshold of what we will defend. The Defense Committee is a central organizational principle of Black survival. Systematic defense is what Discourse on Colonialism is about, without reserve. I think we are challenged sometimes at those threshold moments. We have to dig deep about what sanctioning all forms of rebellion mean or what it doesn't mean. Because I think that's important too, and that's a conversation. Okay, so for the 3 prompts, the first, if you can go to the next slide, Jay. Okay, the quest for desire. This is me stepping a little bit out of my typical theoretical paradigms, and I'm dipping a little bit more into psychoanalysis. And I'm starting to think about questions of Black women's domination and resistance at a psychoanalytic level. We're keeping that all aside for now. But you will see that this particular workshop is very concerned with the relationship between several male thinkers. And I started understanding that there was an interest in the way Black men get dematerialized across historical episodes. That sounds like really theoretical, but I'll start to bring it out. But what I want to say is that this particular chapter is concerned with Black men and their theorizations in a way. And then I come in later thinking through Black women and the natal drive against dematerialization, assassination, elimination, to give you a framework. But this here is about the higher order task that we're about, or that we're after. And it's me synthesizing. All of these are things I get from discourse and from Winter. So deep commodification, I think that's where the Black entry point to a critique of capitalism is so rich. I always begin with the commodity that speaks. Deep commodification mutilates while it appropriates the metabiological, expressive, and devotional powers derived from our multiple and varied struggles against psychoaffective closure and toward the still yet unrealized autonomy of human agency. What does that mean? Metabiological, expressive, and devotional powers. That ability to read the sign, to be the sign, to see something and make it language. This is what Marx tells us the goal of critique is. It's not to adorn the chain with flowers, Rousseau, it's to pick the living flower. That's what Marx says. And so that devotional realization, that isn't, in Winter's framework, metabiological. Doesn't mean it's not animalistic either. I don't know, because that's one of my issues. But by metabiological, I'm trying to locate it as in a different realm, I guess. And I'm trying to isolate devotion as something that revolutions harness with particular efficacy. And what devotion can do for how we orient our objectives. And the way that commodification preys on these brilliant capacities. And what I mean by the varied struggles against psychoaffective closure, this is a Winterian thing again, which is that every knowledge order closes itself. It has a seam that makes it whole, that makes it total. And you probe that seam, you want to rip that seam. And each human group does this. And you push the closure. That's the heretical movement. You push the closure. And it's those efforts, all of us continuously pushing the closure that we face, the point of coercion we face, that we develop these devotional, these symbolic, these higher order powers. So that's one. Next slide. Okay, sorry, I'm like forgetting to click on my end. Race war, something I've been thinking about for such a long time, and this is provisional as well. Race war is a closed social feedback loop. A feedback loop I'm trying to get the cybernetic theorist in, like Bateson, Gregory Bateson, who's so key to Winter's development and her sense of epistemology, of knowledge, of how you know what you know. So a closed social feedback loop that joins neo-slavery and serial extermination, which we might call eugenics, to the development of the Western world system's so-called sovereign and scientific species perspective. So there's a dilemma in the way that race war nurtures and actually liberates fields of human consciousness, drives science, drives discovery, that underside of which this double bind or this underside Winter's always pointing to. So this formalizes for me an interhuman subject-object uncertainty. I think that's very powerful. Subject-object uncertainty. Are you human? As an absolute presupposition of Western knowledge. And that line is from De Silva, the knowledge apparatus manufactured by the sciences of man and society, but it needs that level of description. Object-subject uncertainty generates inputs and outputs like stranger fruit, fallen genes, and more final solutions, which are these categories I'm trying to think about. All right, next slide. All right, and then final agency is a way of responding to the West's desire for power, not necessarily materially what it's capable of. So who or what in the last instance constitutes the determinate force of history? Final agency names the center's imperative, its drive to answer. That is to realize in history, so in historical terms, so not like some godly power, but something like atomic power, an absolute and unique human power in order to solve by force the question of who we are and why we are here, what Winter calls the puzzle of conscious experience. Of course, reminds Ellen Wood, and I take this reminder very seriously, history always disappoints determinism. Perhaps then final agency, supra-rationally, beyond rationality, devotes itself to the dilemma of determinism, the horizon of such a power, the seductive promise and pull of a theory of everything, in my estimation, needs attention. Okay. Skip the next slide, and then I'll go to a little bit about autonomous frame. So I am not going to break down Winter's article today. I think pieces of it will surface across the three. And it really isn't about Winter, although I tricked a lot of you by putting Winter front and center. This is certainly inspired by Winter's creative ethic. So autonomous frame of reference for me comes from many different places, or the expression of autonomy. And obviously Marxists have so many, and Black radical traditions, anarchists have so many concepts of autonomy. So this is about, again, a positioning and a perspective, not necessarily a political doctrine. It's about a method, of assessment and evaluation. And it's about a standard of evaluation. So I think, though, my favorite line from the piece is no point of resistance to its own specific mode of coercion can be fought in terms of the other. And to me, that brings us to the subjective factor of revolution. Can we go to the next slide? So here are some people, to me, that embody autonomy. These are actually just lines, straight up lines that I fed together to kind of arrive at this orientation. Now, John Swanson Jacobs, I think this is one of the most exciting, written discoveries of the 21st century, is his narrative titled "The United States Governed by 6,000 Despots." It's a theory of master power. They've always done it before you have. I'm working on a theory of master power. He already did it. The United States governed by 6,000 despots. Anyways, John Swanson is actually Harriet Jacobs's brother. Harriet Jacobs being the first Black American woman to write a slave narrative that captures the centrality of sexual violence and violation. Not only that, she has this incredible story of marriage, which is memorialized in Simone Lee's profound work, Loophole of Retreat. If you don't know that exhibit and Simone Lee, please do check out that and Loophole of Retreat. But her brother has been relatively unknown until recently, and still I haven't heard much about his narrative. He goes to Australia because he simply cannot exist in the United States. He's like, I'm maroon and I'm marooning on a boat. And he gets to Australia and he says, I want to write the truth. This is what compels me, this first line. Since I cannot forget that I was a slave, I will not forget slaves, period. No paradigm, no methodological imperative, no theoretical arrival will ever, ever, ever make me forget that there were slaves, that I was a slave. I think that is, what I have done for my liberty, I would do for theirs, whenever I can see them ready to fill a free man's grave rather than wear a tyrant's chain. The historian that found this narrative, he says that Jacobs has this apocalyptic intelligence. I actually think his biography that accompanies the narrative is really tight. It's really well written, and it's some of these things get funny with the framing. So he says it has an apocalyptic intelligence. So that's something I want to move forward with. On the next slide, I want to share with you his kind of theses. That brutality is inseparable from slavery. And I want to reverse that slavery is inseparable from brutality. So wherever and whenever we're speaking of political brutality, institutionalized brutality, we must have a referent about the world that slavery created. That the Constitution of the United States of America is the bulwark of American slavery. Obviously, there were different abolitionist tendencies, and you see which camp he stood in. The Constitution is irredeemable. Not only that, but the only hope of abolition is separation from the Union. I will go into his narrative later in later workshops, probably the second one. But I find that someone who escaped and spoke with this voice has a set of things to say and observe about Western fundamentalism. The next slide. Where am I on time? Okay. Of course, the classic. This is a classic. I mean, truly, I think Robin Kelly says that, discourse is almost a declaration of war. It certainly speaks in revolutionary cadences. And yes. The fact is that the so-called European civilization, Western civilization, as it has been shaped by 2 centuries of bourgeois rule, is incapable of solving the 2 major problems to which its existence has given rise: the problem of the proletariat and the colonial problem. That is the paradigmatic statement. And holding those 2 with equal authority, but recognizing the African, what he calls singular situation in the world, in addressing the dual problem of the bourgeoisie's rule, to me is clarifying. Next slide. As for we who have decided to break the back of colonialism, our historic mission is to sanction all revolts, all desperate actions, all those abortive attempts drowned in rivers of blood. I mean, it speaks for itself, but it actually doesn't, because there's great internal debate about what individual action means, what collective action means, what political action outside of organizational instruction means, how it invites repression or opens political space. And I've had a good, not good time, but I think these are so key, because we are theorizing in real time how you break open a revolutionary space, a radical space, or even a space of response in increasingly hostile, militaristic, and ready regime, LA. And then finally with Winter, in the next slide, can you offer a breakthrough? When the ideas have not worked, when the ideas need a new angle, when the ethical comportment isn't there, when the material conditions are changing underneath your feet, do you have the humility to move and work and create something new that holds on to the theoretical density of the past? And that's why the film, I want you to watch it, or we'll talk about it with a critical eye, because theorizing power does require a sensibility of the past. The coloniality of the past is really key there. Okay, let's see. I've been talking for half an hour, but this is what I'm going to do. With those prompts, and these are my pillars of autonomous thinking, I ask you, who are yours? I ask you, do these people serve you? And if not, why? Because autonomy might require different concepts from where you're struggling or from your point of coercion. But these are the prompts. These are the people I weave together to create this analytical space of Western fundamentalism. So now what I'll do is I'll read a little bit of the opening of my book, and then I will stop and we'll do a media session so you can relax. And we'll watch a little bit of Hypernormalization with some of the things I put on the table, the feeling I put on the table. I'll read some more, and then I'll go into Césaire. And again, we'll keep playing it by ear. But I really appreciate you staying with me. Okay, so a pall of darkness draws over the West. Now, there's a lot of direct quotes from Césaire. I'll try to air quote my way through them, but I am trying to do something like romantic with Césaire, with all of these thinkers. There's like an embeddedness, a total dance I'm trying to do with them, like a fusion. So there's a lot of little like tiny nods throughout what I write to pieces of Césaire's text. A pall of darkness draws over the West. The truth of the Western world system, our epic, the epic of the bourgeoisie, that's a Communist Manifesto, is imperiled. The myth of immaculate conception shatters. The dissolution of an age unfolds. Atlanticism is in crisis. The free world in free fall. And you see that by that random civilizational plea they just sent out to Europe, which is so interesting because Anthony Blinken wrote a piece in 2001 about the transatlantic strategic split is in the minds of the European elite. When we know, Samir Amin teaches us, that it is a structural feature of the post-world system. So I think this pushing on Atlanticism and the way fascists in Europe are reconceptualizing the European Union, not the actual, but the idea of the European family, Meloni specifically in Italy, very important, because Western declinism is on their minds. It always is on everyone's mind. But there's something qualitatively different here. Atlanticism is in crisis. Every nation is the name of a war, is the permanent commodification of violence, hacking and harvesting, abusing the miracle of the social link. The social link comes from a Haitian psychoanalyst, Willie Apollon, who is foundational to my work now. The Miracle of the Social Link. Democracy's open secrets, race and class war, overwhelm the multicultural social truths at home. The multicultural social truths at home and the pacification project abroad. See those two poles. Humanitarianism shatters under the weight of its human remains. These are headlines. Gaza Humanitarian Fund, a cutout with ties to Israeli and U.S. intelligence, turning food delivery into death traps. Israeli strikes on Gaza schools used as civilian shelters are part of deliberate strategy. Genetic massacres. This is a concept that I use. Genetic, meaning law creating, genesis. Genetic massacres. That is the institutional capacity to bring kill power into legal representation and cultural meaning, to establish the master settler CEO claim, mass killing out of which the culture of law is born. These are vital. Black sites and operations, precision policing, that's a theory of policing developed out of my own school, precision policing. Domestic covert actions, double tap strikes, counterinsurgency campaigns, targeted assassination, mass incarceration, administrative detention and deportation, target development, genocide, all line up human life along the Western war powers continuum and send it off into circuits of recursive simulation. So by that I mean Du Bois's famous line, the preparation for war is the cause of war. And this affects the total dissimulation of open warfare at home and abroad. It's very hard for us to say what war is and what it is not, even though we know what it is. But repurposed against itself and the denial of its ordering effect, the war powers continuum doubles as a cross-sectional cut. So that anatomical cut when you want to open something, listen, the sciences, a cross-sectional cut, a line of sight into the secret of the hypocenter, where we find Black Hydra. So the hypocenter is Joy James's idea of the subterranean focal point, not the conflict existing at the surface, but the conflict at the center of, like, the subterranean, the source of the shock. I like that very much. And Black Hydra, as Russell Maroon Schultz, the brilliant revolutionary, his idea of decentralized autonomous Black struggle. So when we repurpose the war powers continuum against itself, we get to the hypocenter and we see the Hydra, the decentralized Black liberation struggle. This is what fascinates me about the Black Liberation Army, that it goes from party to a networked subterranean or underground form. And that jump from party to networked armed struggle seems very important to me, and something about this hypocenter and Hydra. Paranoia blooms and people crave meaning. Nothing without the interpretation of meaning, whispers Winter. Anti-establishment extremisms, real and imagined, state-centric and anti-state in form, they bubble up across the political spectrum in search of this autonomous frame of reference and, more importantly, the power to enforce it. The torturers standing around the racks invent, refine, discuss. That's Césaire. But something evades them. Isn't it clear? It's like me talking to myself. That the American century is over, but the 20th century remains an open wound that will not heal. That the 20th century's institutional remains, party, man, nation, which Césaire takes a hacksaw to in discourse, they struggle to survive the 21st century's principle of ruin and revelation. That the underground forces with which they collaborate and these emerging technologies whose profits they reap overwhelm on continuum reason, and discipline and divert the already mutilated will of the people toward the total gamification of reality. That the eugenic cocktail of conceits, drip-fed by culture and force-fed by war, they carry consequences. Western kill webs, which Obama stewards, he takes us from the kill list to the disposition matrix. Now we have the kill web. These are ways of organizing kill capacity. Western kill webs coincide with broader interstate efforts to landscape, raise, and resolve holdover catastrophes, these outstanding anti-development, intractable 20th century struggles challenges to the world system they want. After nearly 3 centuries of Western bourgeois rule, so there's Marx and there's Césaire, now I'm coming in with the 3rd century here. Ideological fractures and material emergencies injure life at every scale. Maximalist forces bear down on the terms of order, that's Cedric Robinson, those sanctified categories of the master conception, right? They're founding categories. That's Winter. And the legitimacy demands of the liberal way of war, Samirman. But now, their categories only seem to frustrate them. In this context, America presents as an injured animal. I thank my colleague Nick for that image. Presents as an injured animal fitfully, dangerously relapsing into a culture of dark fantasy dark instinct and high fantasy it has failed to outgrow. Europe remains indefensible, Césaire, and with shameless cruelty, the world system's sub-imperial junior partners on the ascent, capitalist states to whom the political economic security complex of the war on terror and of accumulation has been structurally outsourced. Those powers deepen while they reinvent and localize the developmental double bind of Western rule. This is Sudan. This is Congo. What curious, menacing re-alignments saunter into view. Across the third world, manic accumulation and privatization of force increasingly present as total war. The paramilitarization of Haitian society, of civil society, has now reached a terror status. We have mercenaries going into Haiti, disgraced mercenaries at that. The national security wars, shorthand for the war on terror, the coalition's national security wars, they developed a shared set of techniques across key, though repressed, fields of the third world. Haiti and Afghanistan, for example, are central to my thinking. And there's a journalist who's done some stunning cross-reading between the experiments and early aughts humanitarian warfare in Haiti and Afghanistan. I want to read a little bit of his intro, and then we will watch. So I'll stop and we'll have some time to watch. This book is called Aid State. I think Haiti is the country with the largest number of NGOs in the world. That was the strategy of containment, to destroy by NGOization. But similar tactics were used in Afghanistan and similar processes of the war on terror. And what I like about what this book does is that it gives us a better descriptive power that links these fields of struggle than the string of signifiers that even I almost just fell into, which is free Palestine, free Congo, free Haiti. And it becomes just a chain of signifiers because we don't know the point of coercion that we're fielding. So let me read this because I think it's very important to understand how Haiti and Afghanistan are fronts. And that Western fundamentalism allows us to see them as fronts. The largest air-based mass expulsion of immigrants happened under Biden to Haitian people in a 2-week period. 20,000 people deported in 2 weeks under Biden. That is the largest mass expulsion. But Haiti does not register, blah, blah. I don't want to exercise its disappearance over and over again. I want to come up with a theory that accounts for it as a central node in how the world system is remaking itself. Because where it's going is a world system with a questionable hegemon. And that's the key. That's the exciting and scary part. Okay, so this is a couple pages. So let me read this, and then Jay will go into the films. So yeah, okay. On August 14th, 2021, about 100 miles to the west of Port-au-Prince, the capital of Haiti, the tectonic plates lurking beneath the Earth's surface slipped, producing a 7.2 magnitude earthquake, twice as powerful as the one that had hit in 2010, an event that had forever altered the history of the nation, and where this book begins in chapter 1. Once again, hospitals and schools collapsed, homes were destroyed, entire communities were cut off from the outside world. Thousands died. This time, however, the capital was spared the worst. And yet, coming just over a month after the assassination of Haiti's president, President Jovenel Moïse, where this book ends, the government was in no better position to respond than it had been 11 years earlier. If the measure of success after a natural disaster is how much better prepared the country is for the next one, the 2021 quake served as a punctuation mark on the failures of the decade-long reconstruction period. The next day, thousands of miles away, a different kind of earthquake shook the foundations of another nation. On August 15th, Afghanistan's president fled into exile, and Kabul fell to the Taliban. It occurred just as the US neared completion of its troops withdrawal after 2 decades, a deployment that had only recently surpassed the early 20th century occupation of Haiti as the longest in US history. Though on their surface the events appeared distinct and unrelated, the earthquake in Haiti and the Taliban takeover in Afghanistan revealed a deeper commonality. After the fall of Kabul, Washington's foreign policy establishment lit up with experts asking and answering the question of why nation building in Afghanistan had failed so miserably. But few seem to be wondering the same about Haiti. In the latter's case, the president's assassination and the earthquake simply proved that Haiti was a failed state. But America's foray into nation building had not been confined to Afghanistan. US troops landed in Port-au-Prince a few years after deploying to Kabul. They were, however, quickly replaced by some 10,000 United Nations soldiers, though the occupation occurred largely outside the public's view. A parallel effort to that in Afghanistan had been taking place in Haiti for nearly as many years. I'll stop there, but to put those occupations as kicking off the same kind of leg of political struggle and using similar techniques is something I'd like to think about as we go into the media session.
Cool. We're going to start with hypernormalization, right?
Yes, that would be great.
Okay.
Okay, so Jay, feel free to chime in about this. I'm giving this to you all because I think it does a couple of things. It constructs a visual argument that's really compelling, but because the visuality is so compelling, it's analytically tricky. It says a lot about the world system without imperialism or colonialism or the West. And it does so in a seductive way that accounts for a kind of Western supremacy while it undoes it by these Islamic phobic gestures and imperial gestures later. So I want you to pick up on the questions around the construction of social reality, the withdrawal of revolutionary confrontation, but also the meta theory he has, because I have issues with those, but they're compelling points because we ain't never disappeared. That's not the issue. And I'm sorry, I'm sweating so much. So the irreality and reality of the post-revolutionary 60s, the way he tries to name capitalism without naming it. So just the symbol of the bank. So there's these gestures of interpretation that actually reinscribe Western power. But there are some kind of acts of revelation that are interesting. So I want you to read with 2 eyes or watch with 2 eyes. Jay, if you have anything.
I thought it was a really interesting film, and I, encourage people, obviously, you're supposed to watch it, but if you haven't, then watch the whole thing, but I did have issues, particularly as it got into its analysis around the Middle East, Syria, Palestine, Egypt, and kind of, it did feel stuck, fittingly for this, for the title of this, workshop series, kind of within a kind of Western fundamentalism, still as it is also trying to account for a decline of political alternatives and it has critiques of empire, but it doesn't really name it as empire either or
Right.
imperialism. And I think that, there are ways that at certain times it creates kind of what I would deem false equivalencies between different levels of power within the world system. But yeah, so that's my only like cautionary note to it. But I think that, it's an interesting watch.
Awesome. Thank you, Jay.
Right on. All right, should I go ahead and start it?
Yeah, we'll do like 25 minutes maybe.
Okay.
live in a strange time. Extraordinary events keep happening that undermine the stability of our world. Suicide bombs, waves of refugees, Donald Trump, Vladimir Putin, even Brexit. Yet those in control seem unable to deal with them. And no one has any vision of a different or a better kind of future. This film will tell the story of how we got to this strange place. It is about how over the past 40 years, politicians, financiers and technological utopians, rather than face up to the real complexities of the world, retreated. Instead, they constructed a simpler version of the world in order to hang on to power. And as this fake world grew, all of us went along with it, because the simplicity was reassuring. Even those who thought they were attacking the system, the radicals, the artists, the musicians, and our whole counterculture, actually became part of the trickery. Because they too had retreated into the make-believe world. Which is why their opposition has no effect, and nothing ever changes. But this retreat into a dream world allowed dark and destructive forces to fester and grow outside. Forces that are now returning to pierce the fragile surface of our carefully constructed fake world. The story begins in two cities at the same moment in 1975. One is New York, the other is Damascus. It was a moment when two ideas about how it might be possible to run the world without politics first took hold. In 1975, New York City was on the verge of collapse. For 30 years, the politicians who ran the city had borrowed more and more money from the banks to pay for its growing services and welfare. But in the early 70s, the middle classes fled from the city, and the taxes they paid disappeared with them. So the banks lent the city even more. But then they began to get worried about the size of the growing debt, and whether the city would ever be able to pay it back. And then one day in 1975, the banks just stopped. The city held its regular meeting to issue bonds in return for the loans, overseen by the city's financial controller.
Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. Today, the City of New York is offering for competitive bidding sale 260 million tax anticipation notes, of which 100 million will mature on June 3rd, 1975.
The banks were supposed to turn up at 11 a.m. But it soon became clear that none of them were going to appear. The meeting was rescheduled for 2 p.m, and the banks promised they would turn up.
The announcement on behalf of the controller is that the offer, which we had expected to receive and announce at 2 o'clock this afternoon, is now expected at 4 o'clock.
Paul, does this mean that so far nobody wants those bonds?
We will be making a further announcement at 4 o'clock, and anything further that I could say now I think would not advance the interests of the sale, which is now in progress.
Does this mean that you have not been able to sell them so far today?
We will have a further announcement at 4 o'clock.
What happened that day in New York marked a radical shift in power. The banks insisted that in order to protect their loans, they should be allowed to take control of the city. The city appealed to the president, but he refused to help. So a new committee was set up to manage the city's finances. Out of 9 members, 8 of them were bankers. It was the start of an extraordinary experiment where the financial institutions took power away from the politicians and started to run society themselves. The city had no other option. The bankers enforced what was called austerity on the city, insisting that thousands of teachers, policemen and firemen were sacked. This was a new kind of politics. The old politicians believed that crises were solved through negotiations and deals. The bankers had a completely different view. They were just the representatives of something that couldn't be negotiated with, the logic of the market. To them, there was no alternative to this system. It should run society.
Just by shifting paper around, these slobs can make $60–65 million in a single transaction. That would take care of all of the layoffs in the city. So it's reckless, it's cruel, and it's a disgrace.
There'd be a fair number of bankers, of course, who'd say, well, it's the unions who have been too greedy. Now, what would your reaction be to that?
I guess they're right in a way. If you can make $60 million on a single transaction and a worker makes $8–9,000 a year, I suppose they're correct, and as they go back to their little estates in Greenwich, Connecticut, I want to wish them well, the slobs.
But the extraordinary thing was, no one opposed the bankers. The radicals and the left-wingers, who 10 years before had dreamt of changing America through revolution, did nothing. They had retreated and were living in the abandoned buildings in Manhattan. The singer Patti Smith later described the mood of disillusion that had come over them. I could not identify with the political movements any longer, she said. All the manic activity in the streets. In trying to join them, I felt overwhelmed by yet another form of bureaucracy. What she was describing was the rise of a new, powerful individualism that could not fit with the idea of collective political action. Instead, Patti Smith and many others became a new kind of individual radical who watched the decaying city with a cool detachment. They didn't try and change it, they just experienced it.
Look at that, isn't that cool? I love that, where like kids write all over the walls. That to me is neater than any art sometimes. Jose and Maria forever.
Oh, there's a lot of things like when you pass by big movie houses, maybe we'll find one, but they have little movie screens where you can see clips of like Z or something like that. People watch it over and over. I've seen people, I've checked them out all day. I've gone back and forth and they're still there watching the credits of a movie because they don't have enough dough, but it's some entertainment, you know.
Instead, radicals across America turned to art and music as a means of expressing their criticism of society. They believed that instead of trying to change the world outside, the new radicalism should try and change what was inside people's heads. And the way to do this was through self-expression, not collective action.
U V W X Y Z.
But some of the left saw that something else was really going on. That by detaching themselves and retreating into an ironic coolness, a whole generation were beginning to lose touch with the reality of power. One of them wrote at that time, It was the mood of the era, and the revolution was deferred indefinitely. And while we were dozing, the money crept in.
What's your date of birth, Larry?
But one of the people who did understand how to use this new power was Donald Trump. Trump realized that there was now no future in building housing for ordinary people because all the government grants had gone. But he saw that there were other ways to get vast amounts of money out of the state. Trump started to buy up derelict buildings in New York, and he announced that he was going to transform them into luxury hotels and apartments. But in return, he negotiated the biggest tax break in New York's history, worth $160 million. The city had to agree because they were desperate. And the banks, seeing a new opportunity,
Hang on one second, folks. That was my fault. I was trying to check the time and it stopped on us. How much more did you want to show, Felicia? You're muted, sorry.
Oh, I found it. Okay. I was like, whoa, okay. Since we're actually behind time, I think you can stop there because I'd like to do a little Césaire and get to that other documentary on 1956. Again, I wanted to give you another sense of, and if you keep going, the first 30 minutes or so, it gives you, again, a world systems theory lacking all of the elements that Jay and I referred to. It also gives you the retreat, the revolutionary retreat, which I want to think against or write against or problematize. So that's what this next little bit of my writing will be. I'll read a little bit in response to kind of the energy that idea of the 70s to the 80s and the consequences thereafter, what that leaves us with. But I do encourage you to go back and think about different ways of constructing world systems. And how is it possible that you can evade the colonial capital question? How can you have because obviously you can, that's what political science is. So I want to read this last little bit and then jump to Césaire. Read a little about Césaire, some things I'm thinking about, and take you through this dialogue I think he's having undercover with Mussolini and Marx. Do a couple of things there, see where we end up, and maybe show that film. Okay. Let's see. Okay. Institutional breakdown releases phenomena, reminds Sheldon Bolin. I really love that. Oh, I write that. A provocative image, for in it, I see a fundamental, irrepressible insight. Democracy's open secrets. Again, I keep reiterating that. Race and class war are phenomena in release. The fact is that the unimaginable evil and dazzling techno-scientific achievements of the Western bloc. You have to hold both of those two, right? The unimaginable evil and the dazzling techno-scientific achievements. Those are Winter's words. Of the Western bloc, its collaborators and apologists carry life on Earth past the point of no return. Sylvia Wynter commits her intellectual energies to locating and elaborating the nature of this double bind. But the fact is, a superpower society, killing and consuming its way across every existing threshold, poses a fundamental challenge to the human community. What comes next? To what unique power does an anxious hegemon aspire? And by way of whose unique suffering will the master plan be realized? What does the West really want? What can the West really do? And to whom among us in this context does revolutionary initiative really belong? The truth is, our planet is held hostage to capitalism's cosmological thesis. I conquer, therefore I am. The truth is accumulation by elimination, which is my spin on David Harvey's concept of the spatial fix of capital. accumulation by dispossession. I'm interested in the drive of elimination and its different guises. It remains the ordering principle of world system warfare, and serial genocide and permanent war, slavery and penalism function as cardinal axes of modern political power. The truth is, we live historically suspended half-lives, differently interred within the infinite distance, that's Césaire's term, between slavery and utopia. The new world is infinite distance. To shorten the distance has been the work of reformers. To annihilate it, that of revolutionaries. The truth is, reminds Dhoruba bin Wahad, these are the best of times for a revolutionary. We are in a historical moment, the Black Power militant reflects. Race and class war again, and notice the wars of the patriarch is not here. That's another way I organize work. It will come back. They cry out for redress with such sincere intensity. Perhaps the political spell under which the human community labors now begins a process of irreversible, though volatile, meaning it might not come out our way, demystification. The question of genocide is actually the question of serial genocide. The question of war is permanent war, and so on. Major and minor principles of distinction that once dutifully administered imperial democracies kill murder code, the absolute line between war and indiscriminate violence, and without which society falls to pieces. This gives way to fascism's ever-multiplying zones of indistinction, wherein the image of the enemy exists in all things and all places. So too accumulation powers for he who can financialize or she the social effects of such indistinction. In war, she remembers, almost everything is a matter of representation. Netanyahu remembers that too. Our best friends in the world, he says, senators I know as strong supporters of Israel, have warned that they cannot support us if images of mass starvation emerge. They come to me and say, we'll give you all the help you need to win the war, but we can't be receiving pictures of famine. But the frame is broken, and it is the subjective factor that is the dynamic factor in revolution and struggle in war. That's Dhoruba again. The subjective factor is the dynamic factor. The fallen gene develops apocalyptic intelligence. The planetary waste product discovers the demonic observer ground outside the field of meanings. The damnés consider complete disorder, Fanon. The anti-norm hacks the mainframe. We seek the meta pattern, the pattern of patterns underneath all of this. And from all this newborn heretical activity, revelation follows. The terms of existence come into view anew. This is the world the master made, but there will be no super slaves, declared Jonathan Jackson, which means we must confront the lie, the myth. Let us call this spell, this ecstatic hold on human work and imagination, Western fundamentalism. Josh Myers begins Of Black Study with the lie. CLR James begins his work on Nkrumah with the myth. And so these are motifs that I'm trying to bring forward. Jay, could you go to the Césaire slide, the green one? Yeah, okay. Why is this? All right, so with my remaining time, I just want to spend a little time with the text I actually assigned you. My students are probably laughing. I do this, I go renegade on the text. It always comes back. And how much I deeply need him as a thinker. Okay. Is race war not the silent referent of this entire security drama? Who has the intellectual will to tell the truth about this war? Who has the political will to stop it? So many wars to stop. The power elite are listening. To all this, they reply, you can't. But of course we can. The recovery of human life from the spoilage of degradation depends on it. And that's Robinson. This motif is something I want to argue against the hypernormalization. We must insist in our capacity to get there. The West security paradigm shatters. Aimé Césaire appears like a spike of light. That's what Breton called him, André Breton, a spike of light. I love that. Look at him streaming through the peepholes of our collapsing present, defiantly avant-garde in the struggle for epistemic and aesthetic autonomy. By this I mean, Césaire uniquely appreciated the epistemological blockage under which Africa labors for self-definition and analysis, so self-understanding. That the resolve to define and develop an account of Africa's singular situation in the world is met with such marked invective, such hostility, demands of us much more analytic curiosity. The truth of the human sciences live in this repression. And it's when I understood, personally me, that Du Bois's insight that Africa is prime cause, that this whole project started to come together. So discourse on colonialism turned out to be a kind of 20th century oracle, but not in the way we needed it to be. In style and analysis, this founding document stays dangerous. The two problems to which Césaire famously makes reference, that of the proletariat and the colonial situation, continue their work as canonical terms of world system warfare. And in a time of experimental cruelties, this idea that Césaire puts forward of a universal law that disappears every decadent class into the dirty waters of history, which at a Chinese forum recently, there was a quote that came out of this report, and it said, China knows that hegemony precedes decline. I love that warning. This is kind of what Césaire is saying as well. But not before snarling, ferocious, shameless descent into karmic barbarism. That idea remains compelling. It's a timeless longing, no doubt, that the final ruling class will stand trial in the name of every ruling class that preceded it, for every and all political crimes. This spirit is renewed under Césaire's analytical captivation with ultimate eruptions. And Fanon carries that forward in a lot of his diagnostic thinking and shock therapy. Césaire, though, is obsessed with how ruling classes die. This is the point I want to make. It's his key contribution that I think gets hidden in some of the ways it gets taken up. This book, or this essay, is a eulogy for the bourgeoisie. Is it any coincidence he wrote it on the eve of the American hour? Violence, access, waste, mercantilism, bluff, conformism, stupidity, vulgarity, disorder. Be careful. That's what he says. Humanity reduced to a monologue. The American hour pretends the disintegration of every living column, meaning every kind of systemic, all the systemic balance that could kind of shelter the West. He's like the American presence, the American imperial arm destroys it all. We struggle from the other side of Césaire's contribution. What interests me, though, is that Césaire never uses the word fascism in the entire essay. Instead, it's the secondary literature that develops out this very, very, very important theoretical linkage. But the question remains, why did Césaire not use the word fascism? Discourse on colonialism is fundamentally and perhaps neurotically obsessed with locating a settler extinction principle within bourgeois rule, a theory of serial genocide among the bourgeoisie, naming this extinction principle the colonial problem, and developing the colonial problem as historically and phenomenologically central to the expulsion of the world system's contemporary ruling class, the Western bourgeoisie. Western fundamentalists desire stranger fruit, fallen genes, more final solutions. And it's here the West will remain, bewitched and arrested by wars of extermination, hanged by supply chains, incapable, as Césaire said 75 years ago, of solving those two major problems. Everywhere life is endangered, disappearing, disappeared, tortured, evaporated, sniped, suspected, tracked, diminished, frustrated, starved, cornered, crushed, and constrained. Yes or no, presses Césaire. Are these things true? But he knows, he says so himself, these corpses don't prove anything. Two images, could you go to the next slide? Of the dead preoccupied discourse on colonialism. On the one hand, the essay is a terrifying portrait of man, one of the values invented by the bourgeoisie in former times and launched throughout the world. That's his words. The depth and derangement of his crimes and their many discursive cemeteries. As such, mutilated bodies from across the mid-20th century's colonial killing fields, bodies both corporal and cultural, they watermark his essay. Heads cut off and eyes poked out in Vietnam, Madagascans tortured, girls raped, good massacres, malnutrition permanently introduced, societies drained, human sacrifice, worker demands drowned in blood, steaming blood, cities that evaporate at the edge of a sword. That's all Césaire. He spares no detail, and he does so not out of morbid delight, but necessity. These lives will not be disposed of so easily and so inconsequentially. Europe, Césaire summarizes, is responsible before the human community for the highest heap of corpses in history. Get a citation, Césaire? We don't need a citation. And I make a systematic defense of the people and living cultures destroyed. There is also the living death of the bourgeoisie, the attacking class that once stormed the Bastille in the name of man, that politically emancipated the state from divine authority. That's really important. Is hamstrung and condemned. In the end, the age of revolutions turned out to be the age of slave wars, and the 20th century a morbid record of such confusion. Jay, could you go to the next slide? And then the next. Okay. And the next. Wait, sorry, where are you? Yeah, okay. And there you go. So in this next section, I want to think about Césaire's fixation on extermination and how colonialism institutionalizes that process. And I want to kind of like sneak through 4 texts really quickly. And from there, I pick up some of these themes through Winter's idea of the immaculate conception of the West, which brings us to some theological shadows in Wretched of the Earth and creation stories, which is what I think is very important in developing an autonomous frame. So hopefully you get there. So the 4 texts I want to think about, Discourse on Colonialism, the Communist Manifesto, Wretched, and Doctrine, share, I think they form the shadow library for Césaire, or not Wretched, obviously, but the other 3. I actually think he's in deep conversation with Mussolini, and specifically some of the movements made in Doctrine of Fascism. I also think Césaire wants to amplify Marx's very important observations about the settler drive of the bourgeoisie. So let me go to the next slide, and we're going to read 2 things from the Communist Manifesto. Okay. The need of a constantly expanding market for its products chases the bourgeoisie over the entire surface of the globe. It must nestle everywhere, settle everywhere, establish connections everywhere. Next slide. It compels all nations on pain of extinction to adopt the bourgeois mode of production. It compels them to introduce what it calls civilization into their midst, i.e., to become bourgeois themselves. In one word, it creates a world after its own image. And the representation form, if you did read the autonomous article by Winter, gets at this idea of the coercive power of representation, the material nature of representation, the representation form underlying different modes of extraction or accumulation. So I love, it's a very famous line, but honing in on the image and form and political form, but really this on the pain of extinction. How does that become a repeated mandate of bourgeois rule? And to who's vulnerable to that? Next slide. So there's a movement that I think Césaire copies to make a point, to reinforce a point that he wants to make about fascism, or perhaps about the bourgeoisie. So I'm going to read a little bit of Mussolini. Mussolini quotes Renan, a 19th century humanist. Renan writes this incredible account of Jesus. So incredible, he's so manly, that the church is like, whoa, why are you endowing Jesus with such normal, like a normal sensibility? So he's a human, like a radical humanist. And the clerical establishment doesn't like him. And he has this great line where he says, I finally realized that knowledge doesn't belong to the church. So Renan's going through this whole revolution of liberating knowledge from the church to further the humanist project, because he's writing in the 19th century. Mussolini uses Renan as like a humanist base for fascism. So I just want to read a little bit about how he does this. And so the last line he ends on is thus Renan. So Renan sets us up. Césaire does something similar in a passage. He quotes Renan without citation and says, who is speaking? Qui parle? And he goes through a bunch of people and he says, Renan. And the gesture is, again, to identify the shared root of liberalism and fascism. But the fact that he never says fascism, to me, signals something about his analytic obsession with the bourgeoisie that I think would be good for us to remember. Okay, so from the doctrine of fascism, democracy is a regime nominally without a king, but it is ruled by many kings, more absolute, tyrannical, and ruinous than one sole king, even though a tyrant. This explains why fascism, having first in 1922, for reasons of expediency, assumed an attitude tending towards republicanism, renounced this point of view before the march to Rome, being convinced that the question of political form is not today of prime importance. And after having studied the example of monarchies and republics, past and present, reached the conclusion that monarchy or republicanism are not to be judged, as it were, by an absolute standard, but that they represent forms in which the evolution, political, historical, traditional, or psychological, of a particular country has expressed itself. Fascism supersedes the antithesis monarchy or republicanism. Tell that to J.D. Vance's little advisors that are like, let's go back to monarchy. So it's interesting. I mean, these tendencies are interesting. While democracy still tarries beneath the domination of this idea, forever pointing out the insufficiency of the first and forever the praising of the second as the perfect regime. Today, it can be seen that there are republics innately reactionary and absolutist, and also monarchies which incorporate the most ardent social and political hopes of the future. All right. Reason and science, says Renan, one of the inspired pre-fascists, in his philosophical meditations, are products of humanity, but to expect reason as a direct product of the people and a direct result of their action is to deceive oneself by a chimera. It is not necessary for the existence of reason that everyone should understand it. And in any case, if such a decimation of truth were necessary, it could not be achieved in a low-class democracy, which seems as though it must of its very nature extinguish any kind of noble training. The principle that society exists solely through the well-being and the personal liberty of all the individuals of which it is composed does not appear to be conformable to the plans of nature, in whose workings the race alone seem to be taken into consideration and the individual sacrificed to it. It is greatly to be feared that the last stage of such a conception of democracy, though I must hasten to point out that the term democracy may be interpreted in various ways, would end in a condition of society in which a degenerate herd would have no other preoccupation but the satisfaction of the lowest desires of common men. Unquote Renan, Mussolini. Thus, Renan, fascism denies in democracy the absurd conventional untruth of political equality, dressed out in the garb of collective irresponsibility and the myth of happiness and indefinite progress. But if democracy must be conceived in diverse forms, that is to say, taking democracy to mean a state of society in which the populace are not reduced to the impotence in the state, fascism may write itself down as a, quote, organized, centralized, and authoritative democracy. Césaire. And this being so, I cannot help thinking of one of his statements. Quote, we aspire not to equality, but to domination. The country of a foreign race must become once again a country of serfs, of agricultural laborers or industrial workers. It is not a question of eliminating the inequalities among men, but of widening them and making them into a law. That rings clear, haughty, and brutal, and plants us squarely in the middle of howling savagery, says Césaire in response. But let us come down a step. Who is speaking? I am ashamed to say it is the Western humanist, the idealist philosopher. That his name is Renan is an accident. And he goes on to do a longer, piece that you can, a longer quote that's even worse. And he says, Hitler, Rosenberg, no, Renan. Okay, can you go to the next slide? I think sorry, go to the next one and then I'll go back to this one. I think Césaire's concern that overemphasizing the shared ground of the bourgeoisie and the fascists can amount to a kind of fatal distraction. The fascist, I'm going back to the former slide, the fascist repeats the repression of the X factor. This is a Winter term. The X factor is the unaccounted for social relation that stabilizes the system. Let's say that's what it is for now. So the fascist repeats the repression of the X factor in that he abstracts himself from the world system that the bourgeoisie built. A fascist has never proven, this is me, that they can run a capitalist world system, but they do wish to capture and mobilize the powers born of it without a sense of historical materialism, because Mussolini says, we don't believe in that. We don't believe materialism actually dictates the laws of history. We believe will, force, spirit, conquest are actually the motors. So we disagree with the Marxists. And in that gesture, that abstraction, Césaire sees something that the bourgeoisie does, or the West does, in relation to the colonial world system. And there's a warning that in trying to track the extremism of the bourgeoisie, you're actually fighting the fascist on the bourgeoisie's terms. And so I suspect that he doesn't name fascism because he wants to know how you end the bourgeoisie. And that Renan piece is not just about a shared taproot. It's about how political doctrines abstract themselves from, or people abstract themselves from the relationships that endow them with power. The bourgeoisie appropriates the absolute state. The absolute state is the last standing form of the aristocrats. That's the last political form they're able to run as a ruling class. And so the bourgeoisie's power, to me, is made or in the image of absolute power and the absolute state. And I take that up through this idea of master and state. Now, the fascist wants to appropriate and abstract themselves from the processes of liberal rule. But that, again, is an idealist abstraction where they're not accounting for the processes that actually allowed them to accumulate bourgeois power in the first place. And like I said, I try to hit this home with the fact that no fascist has ever proven they can actually run a total world system. There's one ruling class that has done that. And there's, to Winter's point, one ruling class that created a world system. That's the ruling class that we're after. And so how do we conform our tactics to that understanding? Sometimes I think discourse becomes about the boomerang, and it disappears the actual critique that, in focusing on the source and the structural linkages and not doing this X factor thing, this immaculate conception, this fascist state exists because we will it to. No, you want to appropriate, unlock, and revolutionize the powers you hate in the bourgeoisie. It's that structural continuity that a colonial perspective allows you to see that I want to point out. And I want to restore discourse on colonialism as an attack on a very specific ruling class, and how the colonial situation gives you a kind of direct action or access to that ruling class. Okay, where am I? 7:30. Okay, maybe you can go forward 2 steps. And I just want to explain this idea of the immaculate conception of the West. I think it's really important that there's this gesture of how do you return the colonial to its appropriate analytical position in the history of capitalism, imperialism, etc. The settler colony. There's also, I want to get into the settler colony, but we'll do that later. For Winter, if you can go to the next one, she sees this movement that I'll summarize here. For centuries, the West has insisted on its own internal dynamism, divine and human, as source and substance of its political and economic supremacy. Civilization, they cry, has never yet been made except by whites. That's from Discourse. And in revenge, affirms Fanon, the native laughs in mockery when Western values are mentioned in front of him. By way of this founding unit fallacy, however, the West abstracts itself from the world system that named it. It's the same mystifying gesture performed by the bourgeoisie and identified by Marx in Capital, what he calls primitive accumulation as economic original sin. Winter takes this insight from Marx and applies it to the colonial problem. The immaculate conception of the West refers to the autonomization, in a bad way, of the West as an act of ideological repression that distorts the origin story, which is a representation of causality of the colonial world system. The next slide. So this is from Marx. Primitive accumulation plays in political economy about the same part as original sin in theology. Adam bit the apple, and hereupon sin fell on the human race. Its origin is supposed to be explained when it is told as an anecdote of the past. In times long ago, there were two sort of people. One, the diligent, intelligent, and above all, frugal elite. The other, lazy rascals spending their substance and more in riotous living. I love that, riotous living. The legend of theological original sin tells us certainly how man came to be condemned to eat his bread from the sweat of his brow. But the history of economic original sin reveals to us that there are people to whom this is by no means essential. Never mind. Thus it came to pass that the former sort accumulated wealth, and the latter sort had at last nothing to sell except their own skins. And from this original sin dates the poverty of the great majority that, despite all its labor, has up to now nothing to sell but itself, and the wealth of the few that increases constantly, although they have long ceased to work. Such insipid childishness is every day preached to us in defense of property. Next slide. So this is Winter, and then I'll stop at the X factor. But I do think you should. This is from Ethno or Sociopoetics, where she develops this idea. Western cultural nationalism, the ideology of Western economic dominance, has always insisted on what we call the immaculate conception of the West. Within this context, scholastic disputes about the transition in Europe from feudalism to capitalism have all had as their point of departure the underlying implication that it was some unique Holy Ghost of the West that set in motion the immense processes of transformation that we refer to as a mutation. The oversight of the X factor has been ideologically deliberate. And she goes into how Wallerstein argues that there's one moment a world system is created, and it's at this time, and the Americas are essential, the discovery of the Americas are essential to that one qualitative point of no return in the construction of a world system. So the X factor is the repressed relation that produces the whole in some kind of respect. Can I have the next? We'll actually zoom through to the one with the egg, like a tornado. So what all of this kind of brings our attention to is creation stories underneath political paradigms. And this is me here. I'm going to read a little bit. Like a tornado hidden in an egg, every creation story inscribes a causal principle, generates and normalizes a set of causal postulates, a theory of force within the scene of order to which it gives life. To the Congo sorcerer, the egg, of course, is a symbol of danger, a power object. It can be charged, a point or piercing through which sublime natural force can be made to flow. So too, I want to suggest of origins. They are dangerous power objects, points through which life force can be accentuated or arrested. The creation story vitalizes the first founding through the play of force it brings into meaning. But like all foundations, the creation story claims a position. And it is that thing about which nothing can be said because it's the origin of all saying. What kind of revolutionary interruption might inspire a cosmogenetic event, an original imagining of creation? Next slide. This is where we get the healer Fanon. Decolonization therefore implies the urgent need to thoroughly challenge the colonial situation. Two N's, sorry. Again, you're hearing Fanon and Césaire, the echoes of each other. Its definition can, if we want to describe it accurately, be summed up in the well-known words, the last shall be first. Decolonization is the verification of this. Now, the last shall be first is from Matthew 20:16. Of course, I had to go back and look because I don't be knowing the Bible verses like that. But what's interesting, if you can go to the next slide, is that it's the parable is like there's a vineyard owner and he hires some workers for the day. They come at the top of the day. I'll pay you a penny each by the end of the day. He's hiring people all day. At the end of the day, he says everybody's getting the same amount. The workers are like, what? The ones that came first? What do you mean? And he responds, are you being evil because I am good? Meaning the last shall be first. And then Jesus kind of uses this parable to when he's with his apostles walking around and, you know, the humble among ask for gifts. I want sight. I want my sons to sit next to you. And when Jesus says, yes, of course, and the apostles are outraged or whatever, indignant about lowlifes approaching Jesus, he, you know, scolds them. And he, you know, this is the parable through which he scolds. But the passage ends on sight being given. And so I always was curious about Fanon's usage. It's like the secularization of Jesus's promise, Jesus being the second creation for the Christian, the material creationism after Genesis, the earthly savior. That second form of political creation to me, or salvation, is interesting. It's like Fanon is rewriting it one more time. That promise of sight that true decolonization offers, expectationless struggle, to minister is to serve, and the true nature of equality. That's really what fascinates me, is it's not the equality of liberalism. This equality might feel terribly, terribly unfair. It distorts your whole sense of order. But it is also a kind of creation story, I guess. Next slide. Okay. And this is what I mean by creation story, because there's such a creative impulse in Fanon's work here. Okay. Ogu mwen blessé, c'est blessé mwen blessé, même pas oué somewhere. If there are Haitian people listening, sorry. Okay. Ogu, I'm injured. I'm injured, but I don't know where the blood is flowing from. From where does all this blood flow? Western Europe's post-medieval economic system, to which we now give the name capitalism, this is Winter, had been initiated as a world systemic one. That's the key. Had been initiated as a world systemic one. What does this mean? This is Fanon. Europe is literally the creation of the third world. The settler owes the very fact of his existence, that is to say, his property, to the colonial system. This is the creation story. And my call to Ogu is to use different modalities of power to start organizing our own sense of where the problem begins. I'm injured, but where am I bleeding from? Ogu, if you can go to the next slide, is again about that question of causality that haunts Black radical struggle. When Frederick Douglass says, why am I a slave? And the beginning of New World thought like crystallizes around that question and the urgency to take action around it. But that cry to Ogu, and I call Ogu for a very specific reason, to me is about the return to causal principles. Winter says that she suffered great isolation, intellectual isolation in the 70s and 80s for flirting around with borderline anti-Marxist ideas, which I don't think would call anti-Marxist. She would call it hypersynthetic, maybe, or that's what I would call it, this hypersynthesis that comes out of a place of deference. But anyways, her, Harold Cruz, these figures, Césaire, that tarry in this place, that exist within this very, very key and central intellectual and material dilemma of how do categories stack up with one another and produce spaces of action. Anyways, the question of causality stalks Black thinking. And she says of the beginnings of her work, who was I to doubt the causal paradigm I was given? And I think that is powerful, and why I think she's so obsessed with origins, and now why I am as well. So I want to finish quickly with a love story. That's an origin story. That the Civil War begins as a romance in duress by this blacksmith. Well, not by, but okay, let me get into it. So Dangerfield Newby, the Ohio blacksmith, assessed the multiple points of coercion against which she pressed and decided on an armed struggle to liberate his family. So Dangerfield Newby was born in Virginia and was eventually moved to Ohio and was able to get his freedom. But he had a family, 7 children and a wife in Virginia, still enslaved. So he went around Ohio working as a blacksmith. Ogu is the Loa, the spirit, the form related to questions of iron, transportation, war, all of those kinds of intensities, but also the power of the energetic principle of slashing, of clearing fields with the machete. All of that energetic sensibility falls in Ogu's world. But he's also part of the founding, and I'm thinking of Yoruba, Fon, like the places I'm familiar with. But Ogu I use because he travels so well across the Black diaspora. He just about makes it everywhere. Anyway, so he's the spirit of the blacksmith. So this blacksmith tours Ohio doing these abolition lectures, the abolition circuit, talking about his case, raising money. He saves the equivalent of $23,000 in today's money in the Bank of Ohio. And new research has shown that his former master just didn't want to honor the deal. So Dangerfield decides, I have no recourse. He's hanging out with this abolitionist up here in Northern Ohio, as the abolitionists did, and a place where a bunch of people would just hang out, sleep for a couple of weeks, strategize, whatever. And so he happens to be there at the same time as John Brown. And he tells John Brown, at this point, I'm never gonna free my family. So I'm ready to join. He's one of the 1/5 of the Black men participants in John Brown's regiment. He is the first killed at Harper's Ferry. His body is left out for 2 days. It's eaten by hogs. He's mutilated, pieces taken of him. But they find 2 things in his pocket, which I will read. If you can go 2 slides over. His wife, Harriet, who we have no visual image of, she left us the words. Harriet wrote him 2 letters that were in his pocket. And he had asked John Brown, can I reply before this pops off? Can I reply to my wife so she knows what's happening? And John Brown said no, according to other people that were there. So let's read these letters, and then we have about 15 minutes. Okay. Dear husband, I received your letter today, and it gives me much pleasure to hear from you, but was sorry to hear of your sickness. Hope you may be well when you receive this. I wrote in my last letter that Miss Virginia had a baby, a little girl. I had to nurse her day and night. Dear Dangerfield, you cannot imagine how much I want to see you. Come as soon as you can, for nothing would give me more pleasure than to see you. It is the greatest comfort that I have, thinking of the promised time when you will be here. The baby commenced to crawl today. It is very delicate. Nothing more at present, but remain your affectionate wife, Harriet Newby. And then the second one, which is here. Dear husband, your letter came duly to hand, and it gave me much pleasure to hear from you, and especially to hear you are better of your rheumatism. I want you to buy me as soon as possible, for if you do not get me, somebody else will. Dear husband, you know not the trouble I see. The last 2 years has been like a troubled dream. It is said that master is in want of money. If so, I know not what time he may sell me. And then all my bright hopes of the futures are blasted. For there has been one bright hope to cheer me in all of my troubles. That is to be with you. If I thought I should never see you, this earth would have no charms for me. Do all you can for me, which I have no doubt you will. The children are all well. The baby cannot walk yet. It can step around everything by holding on. I must bring my letter to a close, as I have no news to write. You must write soon and say what you think you can come. Your affectionate wife, Harriet Newby. So in thinking about Western fundamentalism, the various nature of our points of coercion, creation stories, and the subjective factor as the dynamic factor, as Dhoruba reminds us, I think I want to keep returning. Well, in each workshop, I will return to a kind of creation story that reimagines the why of revolutionary activity. People in LA are defending their families. They're defending their communities. And they're jumping light years ahead in revolutionary processes, or, developing the skills we're going to need to weather this. It's that factor that I want to theorize, amplify, and place within its other systemic kind of environment. There seems to be a denial, a stifling, or withdrawal from the subjective factor. And that's what hypernormalization kind of theorizes. But through kind of these gestures, I want to resurrect these episodes and think about the romantic revolution and the frustrated and unfair extremity Dangerfield had to go. And then also, as we'll go in the workshops, all the natal references from Harriet. In the end, Harriet and family get sold down south to pay the master's debts. He's the first victim of Harper's Ferry, but Harper's Ferry is considered the event that generated the extreme positioning of sides. It may be the beginning of the Civil War, is a romance, a tragic one. Okay, so if you want to go all the way to the last slide, I always read this whenever I'm on a podcast or whatever, but it's or the next one. I think, is there one after that? No? Yeah, okay. I always read this, but it's kind of my way of coming back to reminding myself a couple of things, that this holding of race and class war in a creative way, and this concern over the extermination drive, they're not new by any means. I hope that I am reassembling them through different strategies that create new insights. But the point of my concept is that this concern has deep roots, for good reason. And that the autonomous frame, Western fundamentalism, is one strategy I'm using to develop an autonomous frame. I'm also using master state power. I'm thinking about Black women's lonely vigil above the sea. I'm thinking about absolute negativity from C.L.R. James. My entire work is about how many autonomous frames can we create, not out of fun or theoretical mess, but to bring problems into language and into sight. So Western fundamentalism, while it's still in process, it's made up of all these things I've thrown at you today. It refers to the total ideo-historical groundwork of what Wells called the Red Record, what Antonor Ferment called international wars of extermination based on race. That was in the 19th century. What 20th century revolutionary prison intellectual George Jackson called the fact of racial genocide. The fact of racial genocide. What anti-colonial revolutionary Frantz Fanon identified as generalized homicide. Martin Luther King called it cultural homicide. Patterson said the undeniable record of mass slayings on the basis of race. And in a shared existential cadence, Adam Clayton Powell warned, we must move now under our own power or be exterminated. So I think we're 10 minutes early, actually what I can do is, Jay, ask if you have any, whatever you're thinking about, because that was a lot of thinking. And we didn't get to the piece on the 1956 Paris Writers' Conference. Maybe I'll show that next time. But I wanted to show that so you could get a scene of the militant and fabulous like moment that Césaire was writing out of, but then how chaotic the different streams of analysis were. And that Congress really capture stuff. But I think it's better to like turn it to you, Jay, and we can end early.
Well, thank you for all of this. This is great. There's a couple of things that I captured that people asked along the way that might be so one question here was, can you define what is the West? For example, here in Spain, Valencia, many people do not identify themselves as Western per se. I mean, this was also, I remember one of my discussions with China Mieville, he got frustrated about me referring to Robinson, and I think a discussion of Western time. I can't remember exactly, but he was like, the sense of time within like semi-feudal Ireland was quite different than what it was within capitalist England by the 16th century or something like that, right? And so how
what
do you
is
think about
lost in
that?
homogenizing that unit?
Yeah, how do you think about that?
Yeah, no, I think that's a wonderful question. I think on two fronts. One, I want the implosion from within. So anyone that hates that designation, wonderful. I think that's the point, that it's a process of abstraction that carries people against their will. So I think in my own designation, here's what I'll say. How much nuance do you grant your enemy? I encountered this from an Italian professor about some things we were talking about around sovereignty. And it was similar kind of about the nuances of Europe's internal development. I think for a concept like Western fundamentalism, the least nuance is best. I know that sounds strange, but in developing the world's systemic power of the West and summarizing it, because this is where the details matter, but I'm trying to do a summary that then frees up new details, if that makes sense, to get past Western fundamentalists so I can see Valencia and figure out what is that spatial or geopolitical arrangement that allows me to have Valencia, if that makes sense. That's the thing around Afghanistan and Haiti and about the chain of signifiers is there needs to be a new constitution, a new vocabulary. Even like your point is that my Western might be even on its way out, which is good. The movement, the concept has to be moving. So I guess these are my two responses, that in saying something like Western fundamentalism, does it create space to say, no, I am not that? Two, how much nuance when I'm trying to elaborate the singular situation of the African do I allow into the paradigm? But then there is deep nuance. And I do try to break up the various imperial forces and how they settle. And that's why I said the settler principle. And Jay brought this to my attention when he first interviewed me. He's like, where's the settler and the master? And it really just turned over my sense of what world power is. And so I said the settler function is very key too. So those are some of my first kind of responses. But I think it's brilliant. It's wonderful. And it brings me to the next jump, which is what is the new name for the world system power that's at? Because the West might not be the ruling entity anymore. It's, whatever. But there might be still, there is a world system in place, a capitalist world system. And what will that next, the composition of the next ruling class is quite interesting. And so West might be a failing name. And I would love it to be. But that's wonderful and something I'm still thinking about.
Yeah, right on. Yeah, I mean, the only thing I would say is I think that like there's, you mentioned Samir Amin, and I think like thinking about the core as also another like term for the West, right? And then like even within the core, recognizing that there are peripheries that exist within the core, right? Or that there are there are workers within the core who are a part of the that benefit from imperialism, right? And then there are workers in the core who are, if we think about like what's going on in LA right now, people who could be deported that are doing all kinds of like very low wage menial work probably within the society as well, right? And so like there's there is nuance, but it's not, I mean, one of the interesting things, I guess, is like the question, and this is always a question that I am interested in, is, the benefits of naming things as capitalist, as imperialist versus the West. And I think what is interesting is that the West and what Western fundamentalism and this kind of civilizational discussions, right, is that it does allow, I think, more space to talk about cultural, social, psychological, work that is involved in maintaining the world system, rather than, I love work that focuses on a materialist analysis, but that's not, there's material impacts of these other arenas, right? And I think that it's important to attend to them as well. So
I love that.
yeah.
Thank you. Yes. And I'm going to, whoever put that question, I really love that. And we'll spend more time thinking about these hot zones that disrupt the West from within.
Could you restate or add the name you named earlier on, like a Haitian psychoanalyst? Who was that?
Willie Apollon, WILLY-APPOLLON. I think I recently came across his work. It's honestly breathtaking, stunning. Some of the best like anti-imperialist stuff on voodoo I've ever seen. Some of the and he offers a really great critique of winter. He has a whole different account of the history of language and speech and mental representation, and he brings that to the conundrum of the individual and the group, which is the thing we're all trying to figure out, is the individual and the group. And the way he splices those things through a global system, I've always liked psychoanalysis, but never knew how to traffic in its terms. There's something here that he does that's quite unique. So I'm really into his work now, and it is organizing some of these ideas around the metabiological and the symbolic, or whatever that stuff is. But I'm new to his work, but I'm invested.
Is that the spelling?
Hold on, I can't see.
WILLY, and then the last name APOLLON.
Yes.
Okay.
And he has a clinic in Montreal and a new collection coming out in the spring. And I just think he hasn't really hit the circles that I read in.
There's a weird thing that happens where you wouldn't think that Canadian would be that there would be like a barrier between getting information between Canada and the United States, but there is. Like, books are published in Canada and you can't get them in the United, so there's all kinds of weird stuff that happens.
He blew my mind, and he literally, to me, sits next to Winter in terms of the deep this idea of like a discontinuity, language creating a discontinuity. And I don't know, it's, for me, I'm searching for the task outside of what the West has created for us. So I'm like always on these two trains. I think there is, and I don't want to be theological about it, but I do think there's a higher order task that isn't burdened by the history of the human and like this, and I'm not human and you're not human and they're human. And there's like I'm here for something bigger, and that metabolic, that drive, that devotion, expression, those, I don't know. Anyways, it's how I kind of stack the political struggle with other arenas of struggle. And that's the point, is like what motivates people is profoundly interesting. And we don't have a sense of what that is. And we act as if we do. And that's why when Daruba insists that it's a subjective factor, I'm going to insist on that too, and see where that takes me. And it's some of these ideas where I'm always trying to pull myself into, as Fanon says, the material base of national culture. I'm trying to reimagine what the material base is, but that chapter on national culture is key. It's the key to legitimacy. It's the legitimating function, which is everything for a human being. So,
Right on. Well, a couple of things before we go. So, folks, if you are not yet like registered, go to the link in the show description. There's a little form you fill out, and that's how you get on Felicia's emails, and you'll get everything so that, you know, I know there was a couple people in the chat who were like, oh, I didn't know there were readings in advance. And that's, of course, because we're broadcasting on YouTube. And so people will just come into it. But, you know, go ahead and sign up for that stuff so that you can see and you'll get the materials in advance, have time to read, watch, etc. And, you know, then when you come, the next one is on July 8th. Am I right?
8th, yeah.
Yeah, July 8th. And so same time on July 8th, it'll be 6 o'clock p.m. Eastern time. And, you know, we'll continue there. And then there's a third session that will be in August. So definitely sign up if you haven't already, and you'll get all the emails and, you know, have that stuff. But otherwise, we'll see you in a month. This was great. Thank you so much for doing this and agreeing to let us host it. And yeah, look forward to part 2.
Thank you so much. I'll be emailing everyone on the list with new things to, like new forums to, everything's kind of separate. And so you can pick what you come to. Thank you. There'll be guests in future. So like, you won't have to listen to me and more like dialogue. But I figured for this first one, it's good to just create an energy and whatever. So thank you all. Thank you, Jay. Thank you, Mac. Like, yeah.
Awesome. Thank you.